In today's class, we're going to take a look at the Perl DBI, the database interface for Perl. Perl DBI is a layer that allows you to easily access different kinds of databases, either SQL databases, text files, tab-separated values, MySQL, SQLite, all kinds of different databases. There's two main components to the Perl DBI. The first is the database interface, the DBI, and the second is the database driver. And the database driver is what allows you to access the data. Perl DBI is structured so that you have your individual piece of Perl code, you have the database interface, and then you have your appropriate database driver depending on exactly what your database is that you're interacting with. As I said, Perl DBI works with all common databases, MySQL, MariaDB, Postgres, Oracle, SQLite, etc. And there are even other connections that you can include, like Teradata or Salesforce or Amazon, so that you can connect directly to data sources. For the purposes of this example, I'm going to use SQLite from SQLite.org. It's a lightweight, file-based database that's extremely fast, extremely easy to set up, easy to transfer data between different things, and has full SQL relational capabilities. SQLite is wonderful for prototyping a database if you just have a moderate amount of data and you don't want to go into the heavy requirements of, let's say, a relational database like Oracle or MySQL. In this class, we're going to look at two things. We're going to look at adding data to the database, and we're going to look at retrieving data back from the database. The code that we're going to use is shown here. You can download this code from the URL shown at the bottom of the screen here, rohan.sdsu.edu/tilde-edwards-r/databases/add.pl. I'm going to break this down for you and talk about the individual components. But much of it you've already seen. You've already seen the use strict. You've already seen the use DBI. And then the ID map and the dir are just accessing the ID map file that we created in the previous example where we wrote a web crawler, and the directory of output files. The new part starts when we look at this database handle connection. $dbh equals DBI connect. And we tell the database that we're connecting via an SQLite access, and we're going to access a database called websites.db. We don't need to provide a username, and we don't need to provide a password. With SQLite, there's no username and password control. SQLite assumes that if you have access to the file, then you have privilege to read and write to that file. It's one of the big advantages of using SQLite over a more complex database system. We're going to bring errors up so that we can see them, and we're going to commit all of our changes as soon as possible. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a virtual table of web pages using FTS3. FTS3 stands for Full Text Search version 3. And we've already talked in other sections about full text search in SQL databases. And FTS3 is the SQLite version of a full text search. What that means is that I can add the contents of a database, of an HTML file to my database. I can build a full text search on those contents, and I can go ahead and search for keywords that appear associated with particular URLs. I'm going to have 3 columns, an ID column, a URL column, and a contents column. Then I'm going to prepare a command that will allow me to insert data into the web pages. The prepare statement shown here does several things. First of all, it says, I want to prepare a statement, insert into my webpages.database file. I've got the columns, ID, URL, contents, and I'm going to have 3 values. But I'm going to initially start with those values being 3 question marks. These are called bind parameters. What this means is that when I prepare the statement, those 3 variables are left empty. I can add data to those 3 variables at any time I like. When I add that data, the Perl database driver is responsible for and does appropriately escape the data. What that means is that if somebody does something malicious, if they try and insert something inappropriately into my database, it will be escaped by using these bind parameters. Whenever you're writing code to add data to a database or retrieve data from a database where you're using an SQL query, it's imperative that you use bind parameters to prevent people from either deliberately or accidentally corrupting your database by putting in the wrong kinds of data. So we're going to prepare a statement. We don't actually execute it until a little bit later. And in the second half of the code shown here, we open our ID map file. When we created our websites, that was called url.map. And then we read through that file. We take the ID and the URL. If we can find the appropriate HTML file, we open that HTML file, we read the whole contents, and then in the last line, we execute adding ID, URL, and contents to our database. This last line is critical. We execute adding ID, URL, and contents to our database. What this does is it replaces the 3 question marks in our prepare statement with ID, URL, and contents. And then notice lastly, we die and raising an error string if that's not successful. If our addition is successful, that's okay. If our addition is not successful, we die. So let's take a look at this file in action. Here's that code that I've just shown you. Here in Vim, the VI improved editor. We start with useStrict. We import our DBI driver. And here we have our DBI SQL websites.db. So we're going to create a file called websites.db. That's going to be our database. We create a virtual table called web pages that has full text search capabilities. And we prepare our statement using our 3 bind parameters. Now we iterate through our ID file. We read every file. I've made a slight modification here, which is that I split out into a subroutine the appropriate way to read the HTML contents. So I have a subroutine called read HTML, which I pass in the location of a file. That gets passed here to infile. I open that file, and then I just read all of the contents of that file. And I return the contents. I print a little message that says I'm adding that to the database. And in this particular case, I bind my 3 parameters individually. I bind parameter 1 with ID, I bind parameter 2 with URL, and I bind parameter 3 with contents. I execute the command, and if the command doesn't execute, then I'm going to die with the error string associated with my database handle. Okay, so let's take a look. I've got my directory. This web directory contains a few web pages that I downloaded using the web crawler shown in a previous online tutorial on how to use Perl to write web crawlers. I'm going to run my add data command, and it takes two arguments. The first argument is the URL map, and the second argument is the directory that has the HTML files. When I run this, I create a database and I add each of those HTML files. Now, when I type ls, you can see I have an additional file here called websites.db. So I've created a database and I've loaded some data into my database. The next step, of course, is to retrieve some data from my database. The way that I do that is very similar. It's a very simple piece of code. I connect to my database using my DBI connection to websites.db. I'm going to ask for a word to search, and then I have my query where I say select URL from web pages where contents match. So that's my full text search on contents. And then I print all of the URLs that match. A very simple piece of code, and it's available from the URL shown at the bottom of the screen. Let's take a look at that piece of code. Here it is. It's just a few lines of code that's going to open my database and search for something. And so let's run that code and say, let's search for something in my database, and I'm going to search for the word fashion. And there are 3 URLs that are returned that have the word fashion in the HTML associated with those URLs. So in this very simple tutorial, I've shown you how to connect to a database using Perl, using the DBI module. I've shown you how to create a database using SQLite, a very simple, a very lightweight way of creating databases. And I've shown you how to retrieve data from the databases. You can do all SQL queries using the prepare statements, not just inserts and selects, as I've shown you here, but you can do much more complicated SQL queries. And I'm going to leave that for you to go and explore how you can do those complex SQL queries in Perl.